Hello, this is Daniel Evans, and I'm doing the Week 8 video reflection assignment for sports economics. So, the first thing I'd like to talk about is this is basically what we talked a lot about in the two Zoom classes this week about how there's a lot of problems with in sports leagues with calculating how much of a player's value or skill was actually from them and not from just being on a team with other incredibly skilled players. Like, if an NFL team wants to get a supposedly great Alabama football player because Alabama's the best college football school in the country, how do they know that all if they want to they're considering paying him a big contract, how do they know that all of his achievements were from his skill and that most of them weren't just from having great other players? Like if it's a quarterback, how do they know that a lot of his achievements weren't from his great wide receivers, his great offensive line, and is he truly worth all the money they're considering giving him? Also, similar to things we talked about in class, I think a lot of the Bishop Sycamore scandal, the one where a team pretended to be a high school team, football team called Bishop Sycamore, I think a lot of the origins about that were because of money, because of the people who created it wanting indirect revenues related to sports like high school football, such as TV contracts, possible sponsorships, even though there wasn't that much direct money being made. Like, even a GoFundMe for like $10,000 only raised a fraction of that. But it is a rather unfortunate example of how the potential for indirect sports revenues that are incredibly high are one reason that a lot of sports teams and even fake ones like Bishop Sycamore make certain decisions. Also, about another thing we talked about in class, I think that the reason that the NFL has a limit on cap space for every team was probably to limit the wealth inequity gap between richer and poor football teams. Like I'm sure the Dallas Cowboys, if there was no limit on cap, they could make far more bigger contracts than the Green Bay Packers, which are publicly owned. So I assume they have less money than the Cowboys if there is no limit on cap space. So it's a surprisingly good way to limit wealth inequality, even if teams with bad cap space might hate it. Also, the topic of TV contracts for sports and things like that, which has been discussed in class both this week and the past few weeks, has made me think about how uh, in the summer of 2021, Disney basically tried collapsing the Big 12 by moving Oklahoma and Texas, their football teams, to the SEC, which the streaming rights for are owned by ESPN, which is owned by Disney. And it is noted that when the Big East Conference for college football didn't go with this plan, when Disney tried doing it with them, they in like a decade or so ago, Disney basically led to their collapse by manipulating all the good teams to move to the ACC or other conferences. And even now, the SEC is trying to manipulate the contract for Oklahoma University in Texas so that instead of moving in 2025 or 6, they move in 2022 or 3. Also, based on the topic of unions and athletes being in unions, which we discussed for multiple times the past few weeks, I think there's a big danger or possible danger of younger athletes not being in unions because it allows them to be manipulated financially and like during the careers a lot easier by contractors and companies than for more experienced players who are usually in unions. Also, also I think that I'm sorry, one second. I think that one bad difference between college football and NFL, based on something we talked about in class relating to like the draft and teams and their quality of players, is how in college football it's usually that the best football players go to the best high school teams, unless some mediocre to bad teams have some really good recruiting, which they usually don't. Like Penn State, they're keeping their very mediocre coach, James Franklin, in large part due to the fact that he's an excellent recruiter And Penn State's usually a good team, even if they weren't in the last season. So like the best teams usually have the best recruiters because they get the most sports money from contracts, and that just leads to more athletes going to the best teams. Unlike the NFL draft, where the worst teams have the first draft and thus have a better chance of getting the best players. So it's an unhealthy cycle in college football where best teams get best players, so forth and so forth. So and basically the worst teams are less likely. Like hell, that's why a lot of teams switch to certain conferences so they can have more chances of getting good players. It's less about bad teams getting a fair chance and more about teams of certain good qualities and in certain regions having the best chance at a good draft. Also, my two discussion questions are based on both the points I listed above and on certain points in class this week and the past few weeks. Does does money have any major notable influence in college sports, especially college football? Like, does it have any major like influential effects or impacts on certain decisions or institutions? And if so, how so? And how would it be similar and or different to the influence of money in the professional sports? Like differences between money's impact in college and professional football or basketball? Also, based on recent events and how we discussed those recent events involving baseball, and I was thinking about this and discussed with some people, and does the lower amount of baseball in colleges compared to the amount of college basketball and football, because we know that college basketball and football are both thriving while baseball really isn't, does that have any influence on the decline of the baseball industry? Is it an accurate reflection? Like, would it be a potential cause of the decline of the baseball industry, the fact that it's not as popular in colleges, or is it a symptom, not the cause? Anyways, those were my two discussion questions, and that was also my points and the reflection for this week. Thank you very much for watching, and have a good day.